Expository Discourses in the First Epistle of Peter by John Brown. Discourse 9. A second figurative view of the state and character of Christians with appropriate exhortations. 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 11 and 12. Dearly beloved, I beseech you, as strangers and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lusts, which war against the soul, having your conversation honest among the Gentiles, that, whereas they speak evil against you as evildoers, they may, by your good works, which they shall behold, glorify God in the day of visitation. These two verses, which form one sentence, bring before our minds a very important department of Christian duty, to the illustration and enforcement of which it is our intention to devote this discourse. The subject naturally divides itself into two parts, an injunction of duty and a statement of the motives which urge compliance with that injunction. The duty enjoined is twofold: abstinence from fleshly lusts, and having the conversation honest among the Gentiles. The motives are these, quote, "Ye are strangers and pilgrims," end quote. Quote, "These lusts war against the soul," end quote, and abstinence from them, and the maintenance of an, quote, "honest conversation among the Gentiles," end quote, have a tendency to overcome their prejudices against both you and your religion, and to lead them to, quote, "glorify God in the day of visitation," end quote. To unfold, then, the meaning of these injunctions, and to point out the force of these motives, are the two objects which I have in view in the following remarks. 1. The duties enjoined. 1. Abstinence from, quote, "fleshly lusts," end quote. The first duty enjoined in the text is, quote, "abstinence from fleshly lusts," end quote. Quote, "lusts," end quote, in the New Testament use of that word, signifies desires, strong desires, usually inordinate, unduly strong desires. The phrase, quote, "fleshly lusts," end quote, is often considered as meaning desires for sensual enjoyment, desires which obtain their gratification by means of bodily organs. This is, however, very unduly to limit the signification of the term. Among the, quote, "works of the flesh," end quote, which are just the lusts of the flesh embodied, we find enumerated, quote, "hatred, variance, emulations, wrath, strife, seditions, heresies," end quote, as well as, quote, "adultery, fornication, uncleanness, and lasciviousness," end quote. Flesh is the principal constituent of the human body, and the body is the visible part of the compound being, man. Hence flesh comes to be used for human nature or mankind. All mankind, since the fall, are depraved beings, and hence flesh is often, especially in the epistolatory part of the New Testament, used to signify fallen human nature, or mankind as depraved. Agreeably to this use of the term flesh, fleshly desires are those desires which characterize mankind as depraved, which belong to, and are distinctive of, fallen human nature, what are elsewhere termed, quote, "worldly lusts." The desires, including under that name the appetites and the passions, as well as those principles of which the word, quote, "desires," end quote, is the appropriate technical name, form a very important part of our active nature, and are fitted to serve numerous useful and benevolent purposes. The desire of meat and of drink, the desire of knowledge, the desire of esteem, the desire of power, the desire of property, and other desires of a similar kind, belong essentially to human nature, and are as much the gifts of God as reason or conscience, and, like these higher faculties, are plainly intended and calculated to minister to man's improvement and happiness. Some of these desires, as belonging to man as an embodied being, may be termed fleshly, as they cannot exist in purely spiritual beings. But these are not the desires here referred to. God never requires impossibilities, and to abstain from the desires we have mentioned is an impossibility. Those desires are neither virtuous nor vicious. They are parts of our constitution, which ought to be regulated and restrained when they come in competition with more important principles, which, in a perfect state of human nature, they never would. To eradicate them if the thing were possible, which I believe it is not, would not be to improve, but to mutilate human nature. The amputation of arms and legs would not at all add to the beauty and usefulness of the human body, and just such an improvement on the mind would be the depriving it of any of those active powers with which its infinitely wise and benignant author has endowed it. That were to make us, quote, new creatures, end quote, in a sense very different indeed from that in which the apostle uses the term. In no part of our nature has the malignant influence of the fall been more apparent than in our moral or active faculties, and in none of these active powers do we discern clearer marks of degeneration than in our desires. Our desires, in very many instances, seek their gratification in objects the pursuit of which is prescribed by God, as his will is indicated by reason, by conscience, or by express revelation. And where the object of desire is not in itself improper, the desire itself is often foolish, in consequence of its being disproportioned to the real or comparative value of the object, and criminal because unsubordinated to the will of God. These are the desires which are here termed, quote, fleshly lusts, end quote. Such desires as Adam was a stranger to while he continued innocent, such desires as are now characteristic of the whole of his degenerate offspring. These desires, unlike the original principles referred to above, are not to be regulated but destroyed. They are right hands that are to be cut off, right eyes that are to be plucked out. As members of the old man, they are to be mortified. As affections and lusts of the flesh, they are to be crucified. To, quote, abstain from fleshly lusts, end quote, then, is to refrain from desiring that which is forbidden. It is, in other words, to yield obedience to the 10th commandment, quote, thou shalt not covet, end quote. Thou shalt not desire that which God says thou shouldest not seek to obtain. Every desire of what is forbidden, what is criminal in itself, or criminal to us in our circumstances, is a, quote, fleshly desire, end quote, a desire which marks the being who indulges it as morally depraved, and is not to be indulged, even in the slightest degree, is not to be tampered with, but destroyed, strangled in its birth, repressed on its first rising. But this is not all. To, quote, abstain from fleshly lusts, end quote, is to refrain from all inordinate or excessive desire, even of what is in itself lawful. It is in this form of the evil that Christians chiefly need to be warned against fleshly or worldly lusts. It is a sad mistake to suppose that our desires are lawful because the objects of our desire are not forbidden. It may be that they are so far from being forbidden that we would sin if we did not desire them, and yet, in desiring them inordinately, we may sin. Our desires may be, quote, fleshly desires, end quote, that is, desires rising out of the depravity of our nature, and at once exercising and increasing that depravity. To desire anything seen and temporal, be it pleasure, knowledge, power, fame, money, or anything else, as absolutely necessary to, and sufficient for, our happiness, is a fleshly desire. That is, in other words, to make that thing our God, and is in direct opposition to the commandment, quote, thou shalt have no other God before me, end quote, to the breathing of the Spirit, quote, whom have I in heaven but thee, and there is none on all the earth whom I desire beside thee, end quote. He who cherishes any desire unsubordinated to the will of God cherishes a fleshly desire, and from this species of fleshly desire, as well as the former, Christians are commanded to, quote, abstain, end quote. They are to, quote, flee from idolatry, end quote, to, quote, keep themselves from idols, end quote, and, quote, covetousness, end quote, that is, the inordinate desire of any created good, quote, is idolatry, end quote. These, then, are the two branches of the great law, quote, abstain from fleshly lusts, end quote, refrain from desiring whatever is forbidden, refrain from inordinately desiring anything seen and temporal, however innocent in itself. This, like every one of God's laws, is, quote, holy, just, and good, end quote. It leaves abundant room for the healthy operation of natural desires. It allows us to desire everything that is really desirable, in the degree in which it is desirable. It only forbids us to indulge a desire which, whether gratified or not, must end in disappointment and ruin. The language of this law is, quote, wilt thou set thine eyes upon that which is not, end quote, Surely it is impossible not to recognize the divine wisdom and kindness in this spiritual commandment. It puts the check in the right place. It seeks to prevent the works of the flesh by prohibiting the lusts of the flesh. Human laws seek to dam up or divert the stream. The divine law seeks to dry up the fountain. From these few plain remarks, every person who wishes to understand the subject may easily perceive what it is to abstain from fleshly lusts, a much more extensive and difficult duty than many are aware of. But it may serve a good purpose, before closing this part of the discussion, to say a word or two on the way in which we are to yield obedience to this most reasonable command, quote, abstain from fleshly lusts, end quote. The first remark to be made here is that, in order to abstain from fleshly lusts, we must carefully guard against temptation. We are in continual danger. There are always objects at hand fitted to provoke sinful desire in some of its forms, and a busy, crafty adversary is ever ready to take advantage of any opportunity that offers against us. We must therefore avoid placing ourselves in circumstances in which such desires are likely to be excited. And when, by the providence of God, we are placed in such circumstances, we are to, quote, keep our hearts with all diligence, end quote. And, sensible that all our keeping will not serve the purpose, we must give our hearts to God to keep them. We must, quote, watch and be sober, end quote. Quote, be sober and watch, end quote. Quote, watch and pray, end quote. And this should be our prayer, quote, incline my heart to thy testimonies, and not to covetousness, end quote, the general name of fleshly, worldly desires, quote, turn away mine eyes from beholding vanity, end quote. We must recollect that nothing can overcome the world, and the things that are in the world, quote, the lust of the flesh, and the lust of the eye, and the pride of life, end quote, and, quote, the God of this world, end quote, who by these subjugates us, and makes us his slaves, but the word of God dwelling in us. It is our faith, end quote, of that word, or, to employ an equivalent expression, that word believed, that, quote, overcometh the world, end quote. It brings us under, quote, the powers of the world to come, end quote, and thus, quote, delivers us from this present evil world, end quote. Were the realities of eternity habitually before the mind, fleshly lusts could no more take root and flourish there than, quote, perishable materials be reared into structures amid the fires of the last day, end quote. The grand preservation against, quote, fleshly lusts, end quote, is to have the mind preoccupied with spiritual and heavenly affections, and to have the heart so full of holy happiness in the enjoyment of God, as that there is neither room nor relish in it for low-born, earthly, sensual, sinful enjoyments. The strong man can be put out of the house, and kept out of it, only by the stronger than he getting possession, and keeping possession of it. The true way of emptying a vessel of atmospheric air, and keeping that from reoccupying its place, is to fill it with some heavier fluid. It is finely said by the good Archbishop I have so often quoted to you, quote, the happiness and pleasantness of the Christian's estate sets him above the need of the pleasures of sin. The Apostle has said before, since ye have tasted that the Lord is gracious, desire the sincere milk of the word. Desire that word, wherein ye may taste more of his graciousness. And as that fitly urgeth the appetite's desire of the word, so it is strong to persuade this abstinence from fleshly lusts, yea, the disdain and loathing of them. If you have the least experience of the sweetness of his love, if you have but tasted of the crystal river of his pleasures, the mouldy, polluted pleasures of sin will be hateful and loathsome to you. Yea, the best earthly delights that are, will be disrelished and unsavoury to your tastes. The embittering of the breasts of the world to the ungodly by afflictions doth something, indeed, to their weaning from them, but the breasts of consolation that are given them in their stead wean them much more effectually. Quote, the true reason why we remain servants to these lusts, some to one, some to another, is because we are still strangers to the love of God, and those pure pleasures which are in him. Though the pleasures of this world be poor and low, and most unworthy of our pursuit, yet so long as men know no better, they will stick by those they have, such as they are. It is too often in vain to speak to men on this, to follow them with the Apostle's entreaty, I beseech you, abstain from fleshly lusts, unless they that are spoken to be such as he speaks of in the former words, such as have obtained mercy, and have tasted of the graciousness and love of him whose loves are better than wine. Oh, that we would but seek the knowledge of this love. Seeking it, we would find it, and finding it, no force would be needful to pull the delights of sin out of our hands. We would throw them away of our own accord." End quote. This is the true secret of yielding obedience to the commandment in the text. Abstain from fleshly lusts. Oh, that we all were experimentally acquainted with it. How happy, how holy should we be? 2. Quote, having a conversation honest among the Gentiles. End quote. The second duty enjoined in the text is, quote, have your conversation honest among the Gentiles. End quote. Quote, conversation, end quote, here, and in many other places in the New Testament, does not mean colloquial intercourse, but conduct, general behavior, as, quote, only let your conversation be such as becomes the gospel of Christ, end quote. Quote, be holy in all manner of conversation, end quote. The term, quote, honest, end quote, here, as in some other parts of the New Testament, is used in a somewhat obsolete sense, as equivalent to honorable, respectable, morally beautiful and lovely, what commands esteem and reverence. Quote, have your conversation honest among the Gentiles, end quote, means let your conduct be such as will meet the approbation of God and good men, and such as even the heathen shall be obliged to venerate. It is materially the same exhortation as that given by the Apostle Paul to the Philippians, quote, whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest, end quote, venerable, quote, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are of good report, if there be any virtue, if there be any praise, think on these things, end quote, do these things. The heathens were poor judges of Christian doctrine. There was much, too, in the Christian character, the excellence of which they could not at all appreciate. But when they saw Christians making it plain that no temptation could induce them to deviate from the straight path prescribed by the laws of temperance and chastity and justice and love, rendering to no man evil for evil, meekly suffering many injuries, but inflicting none, denying themselves the comforts of life, to supply those who were destitute of its necessaries, sacrificing and suffering everything rather than violate conscience, they could not help feeling how beautiful and how awful goodness is, and a testimony was silently lodged in their hearts in behalf of the religion of Christ, which no reasoning could have placed there. Quote, there is a majesty in strict, serious, consistent goodness that commands esteem and reverence from the worst of men. End quote. The positive command includes the negative. Beware of everything in your conduct which might shock the moral feelings of a heathen. Beware of anything which might lead him in any way to form an opinion dishonourable to, quote, the worthy name by which ye are called, end quote, or open his mouth in blasphemy against him to whom it belongs. It is a most important duty incumbent on Christians in all countries and ages, living among the men of the world, remembering that, among other proofs of their Lord's graciousness to them, he has made them the guardians of his honour among men, to act a part which shall command the respect and esteem of those around them, and to be careful that they let not, quote, their good be evil spoken of, end quote. It deserves notice that the two duties enjoined are represented as very closely connected. It is by abstaining from fleshly lusts that their conversation was to be honest among the Gentiles. If they did not abstain from fleshly lusts, their conversation would be dishonourable, both to themselves and to their religion. If they did abstain from fleshly lusts, an honest, honourable behaviour would be a matter of course. The heart must be kept with all diligence, if we would wish the issues of life which flow from it to be satisfactory. Let the heart be regulated. The tongue, the eyes, the hands, the feet will all be properly employed. Let the thoughts and the desires be as they ought to be, and the actions will be unblameable. If the corrupt spring is not cleansed, the stream cannot be pure. If it is, the stream cannot but be pure. It is a sad mistake to think that the conduct will ever be what God would have it to be till the heart is changed, that the conversation will ever be really comely while men do not abstain from fleshly lusts. The heart must be, quote, purified by the Spirit through the Word, end quote, in order to man's being, quote, holy in all manner of life and conversation, end quote. And it is not less true, and not less important, that the want of a comely conversation, of a holy behaviour, is a proof, whatever profession men make, that fleshly lusts still hold dominion within, As the fruit cannot be good if the tree is not good, so neither can the tree be good if the fruit is not good. The goodness of the tree is the necessary cause of the goodness of the fruit, and the goodness of the fruit is the only satisfactory evidence of the goodness of the tree. So much for the illustration of this branch of our subject. The injunction of duty, quote, abstain from fleshly lusts, having your conversation honest among the Gentiles, end quote. Refrain from desiring what is forbidden. Refrain from inordinately desiring anything that is seen and temporal, and thus maintain a habitual behaviour so morally lovely and venerable that even your heathen neighbours shall be constrained to take notice of you, and trace the obvious effect to the hidden cause, the goodness of your conduct to the goodness of your principles. 2. Motives to the discharge of these duties. Let us now turn our attention to the second branch of the subject, a statement of the motives which urge to compliance with this injunction of duty. The motives are drawn from the character and circumstances of Christians, and from the tendency and consequences, both of the course from which they are dissuaded, and of that to which they are urged. The motive deduced from the character and conduct of Christians is contained in these words. You are, quote, pilgrims and strangers, end quote. The motive drawn from the tendency and consequences of the course dissuaded from is, these fleshly lusts, quote, war against the soul, end quote. And that drawn from the tendency and consequences of the course recommended is, quote, that the Gentiles, who spoke against them as evildoers, might, by their good works which they beheld, glorify God in the day of visitation, end quote. Let us attend to these motives in their order, and endeavour to show their appropriateness and their power. 1. Motive drawn from the condition and character of Christians as, quote, pilgrims and strangers, end quote. The first motive is drawn from the condition and character of Christians as, quote, pilgrims and strangers, end quote. In the literal meaning of the words, those to whom they were originally addressed were pilgrims and strangers. They were chiefly Jews and proselytes, living among the heathen inhabitants of the regions of Asia Minor. Viewed even in this way, there is force in the statement, considered as a motive to the duty enjoined. The great body of those among whom you live are serving fleshly lusts. You are constantly exposed to the powerful influence of an all but universally prevalent custom. Beware lest, quote, evil communications corrupt good manners, end quote. There can, however, be no reasonable doubt that the words pilgrim and stranger are here used figuratively, and in a sense equally applicable to all Christians, in all countries and ages, as to those to whom they were originally addressed. In a figurative sense, all men may be said to be pilgrims and sojourners on earth. They are to continue here but for a short season. They are, as it were, on a journey to their long home, and a consideration of this places in a strong point of view the folly of men in allowing their minds to be chiefly occupied with objects and pursuits belonging exclusively to a scene from which they must soon, and may suddenly, depart forever, and which are in no degree fitted to prepare them for that permanent state into which, on leaving the present, they are to enter. But the Christian is, in a sense peculiar to himself, a pilgrim and stranger. He is a child of God, living among the children of the wicked one. He is a citizen of heaven, sojourning for a season on the earth. Heaven is his home. There is his treasure, and there is his heart also. His great object here is to promote the interests of the kingdom that is not of this world, to pass through this land of strangers and enemies with as little injury as possible, to get safe to the better land, and take as many as he can along with him. For such a person to indulge in fleshly lusts is in the highest degree incongruous. Quote, there is, end quote, as Leighton remarks, quote, a diligence in his calling and prudent regard of his affairs, not only permitted to a Christian, but required of him. But yet, in comparison of his great and high calling, as the apostle terms it, he follows all his other businesses with a kind of coldness and indifferency, as not accounting very much how they go. His heart is elsewhere. The traveller provides himself as he can of entertainment and lodging, where he comes. If it be commodious, it is well, but if not, it is no great matter. If he can find but necessaries, he can abate delicacies very well. For where he finds them in his way, he neither can, nor if he could, would he choose to stay there. Though his inn were dressed with the richest hangings and furniture, yet it is not his home. He must, and he would, leave it. It is not for those born from above to mind earthly things. If Christians would but consider how little, and for how little a time, they are concerned in anything here, they would go through any estate, and any changes of estate, either to the better or the worse, with very composed, equal minds, always moderate in their necessary cares, and never taking any care at all for the flesh, to fulfill the lusts of it. Let them that have no better home than this world to lay claim to, live here as at home, and serve their lusts. Let them who have all their portion in this life, who have no more good to look for than what they can catch here, let them take their time of the poor profits and pleasures that are here. But you that have your whole estate, all your riches and pleasures, laid up in heaven, and reserved there for you, let your lusts, your intense desires, not be fleshly, but spiritual, not earthly, but heavenly. Let the spirit outlust the flesh. Let your hearts be there, and your conversation there. This is not the place of your rest, nor of your delights, unless you be willing to change, and to have your good things here, as some foolish travellers, that spend the estate they should live on at home in a little while, leaving it abroad among strangers. Will you, with profane Esau, sell your birthright for a mess of pottage, sell eternity for a moment, and such pleasures as a moment of them is more worth than an eternity of the other? 2. Motive drawn from the tendency of the course prescribed. It wars against the soul. The second motive is drawn from the tendency and consequences of the course dissuaded from. Those fleshly lusts from which Christians are required to abstain are said, to war against the soul. They are injurious to our highest interests, the interests of the soul. They are inconsistent with the peace of the soul. They are hostile to the improvement of the soul. They are, if indulged in, fatal to the final happiness of the soul. They are inconsistent with the peace of the soul. The Christian poet speaks the words of truth and soberness when he says, God is the source and centre of all minds, their only point of rest. From him departing they are lost, and rove at random, without honour, hope, or peace. God is a suitable and a sufficient portion for man, and he only, who takes up with him as a portion, has, or can have, solid rest. He is kept in perfect peace while he trusts in God. Even a single fleshly lust destroys rest, for it takes the soul away from God, the only true rest. But this is not all. Fleshly lusts, though all opposed to that desire after happiness in God which should be the master active principle in our minds, are by no means harmonious among themselves. They, war, with each other, in our members, and tear their unhappy victim in pieces. The lover of sinful pleasure, of power, of fame and gain, knows well that the way in which those lusts drag or drive him along is anything but the way of peace. They are hostile to the improvement of the soul. The improvement of the soul consists in growth in the knowledge of God and in true holiness, in increasing conformity to his image. Fleshly lusts are plainly inconsistent with this. They destroy that calm, collected state of mind, which is necessary to progress in knowledge and holiness. They occupy the time which ought to be devoted to the pursuits which conduce to spiritual improvement, and they utterly indisposed to, they morally incapacitate the mind for, such pursuits. The carnal mind is enmity against God, for it is not subject to the law of God, neither indeed can be. They do not, as has been justly said, only divert from spiritual things for the time, but they habitually indispose it to every spiritual work, and make it earthly and sensual, and so unfit for heavenly things. Where these lusts, or any one of them, have dominion, the soul cannot at all perform any spiritual duty, can neither pray, nor hear, nor read the word aright, and, in as far as any of them prevail upon the soul of a child of God, they do disjoint and disable it from holy things. Finally, if indulged, those fleshly lusts will be fatal to the ultimate happiness of the soul. This is equally plain from the nature of things, and the express declaration of the Word of God. A man under the influence of fleshly lusts, even if taken to heaven, could not be happy, must be miserable. Heaven is a prepared place for a prepared people. The declarations of the Word of God on the subject are most explicit. The end of a life in the flesh is death, eternal death. Quote, "We are not debtors to the flesh, to live after the flesh. For if ye live after the flesh, ye shall die. But if ye through the Spirit do mortify the deeds of the body, ye shall live." End quote. Quote, "Be not deceived, God is not mocked. Whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. For he that soweth to the flesh shall of the flesh reap corruption. But he that soweth to the Spirit shall of the Spirit reap life everlasting." End quote. 3. Motive drawn from the tendency of the course recommended. The third motive is drawn from the tendency and probable consequences of the course recommended. The tendency and probable result of their, quote, "having their conversation honest among the Gentiles," end quote, in consequence of their abstaining from fleshly lusts, is stated to be this, quote, "The Gentiles, who spoke against them as evildoers, by their good works which they beheld, would be led to glorify God in the day of visitation." End quote. The Gentiles, amidst whom the Christians addressed by Peter lived, spoke against them as evildoers. The primitive Christians were very generally represented as monsters of wickedness, as guilty of the most unnatural and atrocious crimes, as atheists and haters of mankind. Even in that circumstance, a reason might be found for Christians being peculiarly careful to indulge no disposition and to follow no course of conduct which could give even the slightest probability to these calumnious misrepresentations. It was of great importance that, when spoken evil of, it should be falsely, obviously, demonstratively, falsely. But this is not the motive here employed by the Apostle. He counts on the natural effect of uniform good behavior on the minds of the observers, and looking forward to a period which he calls, quote, "the day of visitation," end quote, he encourages Christians by the hope that their, quote, "honest conversation," end quote, might be the means of bringing their heathen neighbors to a better mind, quote, to repentance, to the acknowledging of the truth, and of leading them, instead of calumniating and cursing them, to glorify God, end quote. Quote, "The day of visitation," end quote, is plainly the day of God's visitation. God is said to visit men when he gives very decided proofs of his presence and power, either in works of judgment or of mercy. The phrase is used in the first sense in the following passage in the prophecy of Isaiah, quote, "What will ye do in the day of visitation, and in the desolation that shall come from far? To whom will ye flee for help? And where will ye leave your glory?" End quote. It is used in the second sense when God is said to have, quote, "visited Israel," end quote, in Egypt, and to have, quote, "visited and redeemed his people," end quote, when he, quote, "raised up for them a horn of salvation in the house of his servant David," end quote, and when God is said to have, quote, "visited the Gentiles to take from among them a people to his name," end quote, and probably when Jerusalem is said not to have known, quote, "the time of her visitation," end quote, the day in which she might have known, quote, "the things which belonged to her peace," end quote. If the phrase be understood in the first sense, the meaning is that the good behavior of the Christians would, when divine judgments came either on the Jewish or the pagan oppressors of Christianity, induce even those who had formerly spoken evil of them to admit the righteousness of the divine judgments and glorify God by acknowledging how unfounded had been the reproaches they had cast on his people. If the phrase be understood in the second sense, then the meaning is, in the day when God visits these poor benighted Gentiles with his grace, your consistent, holy conduct, witnessed by them, will be one of the means employed by him in leading them to glorify him in embracing the gospel and devoting themselves to his service. This latter view of the words seems, on the whole, best to harmonize with the scope and design of the whole passage. The consistent, holy conduct of Christians has often been the means of promoting the conversion of unbelievers, and few considerations are more likely to weigh with a true Christian as to the adoption or rejection of a particular course of conduct than this, quote, "By such a course I may harden men in unbelief, embolden them in sin, smooth their path to perdition, and obstruct their way to the Saviour. By such another course I may rouse them to consideration, I may lead them to inquiry, I may soften prejudice, I may convert the sinner from the error of his ways, save a soul from death, and hide a multitude of sins." End quote. The great ultimate object which every Christian should, which every genuine Christian does, contemplate, is the promotion of the glory of God. In his estimation, every desirable end is included in God's being glorified. This is, when he acts in character, his predominant design and thought, quote, "that in all things God may be glorified," end quote. Quote, "In what way shall I most advance the glory of my God? How shall I, who am engaged more than them all, set in with the heavens and the earth and the other creatures to declare his excellence, his greatness, and his goodness?" End quote. What formidable obstacles have the earthly mindedness and the unlovely temper and behavior of professed Christians thrown in the way of the glory of God being displayed in the progress and triumph of the religion of Christ among mankind? How have their, quote, "envyings and strifes and divisions," end quote, all, as Paul says, the manifestation of carnality or fleshliness, how have these impeded and all but, quote, "destroyed the work of God," end quote? Never can we reasonably hope for a better state of things till those who bear the name of Christ, abstaining from fleshly lusts, have their conversation more honest, more lovely, more venerable among the Gentiles. When Zion, enlightened by the heavenly beams of sanctifying truth, arises and shines, then, not till then, shall, quote, "the Gentiles come to her light, and kings to the brightness of her rising," end quote. Such, then, are the motives by which the Apostle enforces his injunction on Christians to abstain from fleshly lusts and to have their conversation honest among the Gentiles. Brethren, this is our duty, as well as that of those to whom these words were originally addressed, and the motives presented are such as should influence us as well as them. Abstinence from all that is forbidden or even doubtful, and the having a consistent, uniform, ornamental Christian behavior are duties incumbent on Christians in all countries and in all ages, duties so important and essential that, if they be neglected, we can have no just claim to, quote, "the worthy name," end quote, "which we bear. And are not we, quote, pilgrims and sojourners before God, as were all our fathers," end quote? Are we not, by our profession, quote, "plainly declaring that we are seeking a country, a better country, that is, an heavenly," end quote? Do we not feel that the indulgence of inordinate desire for any earthly good disturbs our peace, and impedes our progress, and endangers our salvation? Ought we not to be desirous to be instrumental in advancing the glory of God by promoting the conversion of men? Then let us, as pilgrims on earth and citizens of heaven, quote, "set our affections on things above, and not on the things which are on the earth. Let us seek the things that are above at the right hand of God. Let us mortify our members that are on the earth," end quote. Let us, quote, "crucify the flesh with the affections and lusts," end quote. Let us repress all the desires, quote, "which war against the soul," end quote. Let us not degrade the souls which God breathed into us, which Christ died to save, which the Holy Spirit is willing to make his dwelling place, into slaves to those vile subordinate agents of the Prince of Darkness, which seek their destruction. Let us cherish all those desires and affections which give peace and health and vigor and activity to the hidden man of the heart. Let us war against those fleshly lusts which war against our souls. Let us, quote, "not be conformed to this world," end quote, so full of, so domineered over by, quote, "the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eye, and the pride of life," end quote. But let us be, quote, "transformed by the renewing of our minds," end quote, and, quote, "prove what is that good and perfect and acceptable will of God," end quote. In fine, pitying a world lying in wickedness and hurrying to hell, let us do all we can to save them. If we can do little in any other way, let us at least, by a holy, consistent conduct, by exemplifying the purity and the peace of the religion of Christ, proclaim to all around us, quote, "We are journeying towards the land of which the Lord hath said, I will give it you. Come with us, and we will do you good, for the Lord hath spoken good concerning Israel," end quote. Quote, "Let your light, then, so shine before men, that they, seeing your good works, may glorify your Father who is in heaven," end quote.